Hello, and welcome to Health on the Line from the NHS Confederation, the organisation that represents members from across the health and care sector in England, Wales and Northern Ireland. Before we set sail, a little sales pitch, just to say to our regular listeners that there's never been a better time to join the NHS Confederation if you're not already a member. Do have a look at our website for details of all our forms of membership and all the resources and events you can access. It really is value for money. And that includes our new conference focusing on one of the government's big shifts, our Care Closer to Home event, happening on the 23rd of April. Go to www.nhsconfed.org to sign up and join us. On Monday, I sat down to do an interview with Richard Sloggett. He's a former special advisor at the Department of Health, and he's the founder, director of Future Health, a research organisation focusing on the future of the healthcare system. Richard and I talked about the relationship between the Department of Health and NHS England, how that relationship is changing. We talked about changes of personnel. And then, as the interview drew to a close, Richard said, "My goodness, Julian Kelly has resigned as Director of Finance at NHS England." So, trying to be responsive, we had a bit of a chat about that as you'll hear. What we didn't know, what I didn't know till we'd gone off air, was that Emily Lawson and Steve Russell had stood down too. Anyway, I've listened back to the conversation that Richard and I had, and in view of those resignations and other announcements we're hearing all the time, I think you're going to find it even more relevant. Richard, welcome back to Health on the Line.
Thanks, Matthew. Thanks for having me back on.
So, obviously, it is a crowded news agenda, and I guess most people are thinking about foreign affairs a lot of the time. But for us in the kind of health world, it's also been pretty lively. What do you make of what's going on, particularly in relation to NHS England, Richard?
Yeah, Matthew, I think it is lively. And I think, we also, you mentioned at the top, a number of different roles that are changing on the NHS side of the system. Alongside those roles, there's also a couple of other ones. One is we'll be getting at some point in the near future a new permanent secretary at the Department of Health and Social Care, which is obviously a very, very important role. Chris Wormold, who held that position, is now the Cabinet Secretary. And we're also going to get a new chair of the Care Quality Commission as well. Obviously, Julian Hartley's gone in as the CEO, but there's going to be a new chair appointed there. So lots of change. And I think what's quite interesting about the most recent set of announcements is obviously they're more on the NHS side of the system. So in the last 3-4 years, what we've seen is mostly lots of churn and change on the political side, lots of different secretaries of state and ministers, and general stability at the top of the health service in the NHS. Now we're getting the kind of inverse of that. We're getting more change on the NHS side, and we've got maybe a bit more political stability with the new government. And as you say, this will have quite big implications, I think, going forward about where power lies and what the priorities are.
And I think we know, don't we, that Mike Richards is taking up that CQC chair role. So as you say, lots and lots of change. Let's start with Amanda Pritchard. I've always said to her and to other people, I guess, that she's got one of the toughest jobs in the country, and she should be, of course, commended for what she achieved in those challenging circumstances and for being the first woman to run NHS England. Now the kind of dust has settled slightly on her announcement. What's your take on her leadership?
I think you're right to commend her role and how she performs in it. We have to remember that when she took over in the summer of 2021, the pandemic was still very real and very much with us. And also then her tenure was about the sort of recovery period after that. We know the huge impact that COVID had on our healthcare system. And Amanda was the person who sort of had to pick things up and then try and sort of drive forward a sort of recovery plan to that. I think she had, Matthew, a quite clear North Star about what she wanted to do. In particular, she really made a big sort of push on making sure NHS staff tried to feel more valued and more supported. I think she took workforce policy in particular a lot more seriously than maybe some others have in the recent past. And she went about her business as a sort of, what I would say, in a more traditional public service type of way. So she was active more behind the scenes than sort of in front of the camera. I think that's where she was more comfortable. And I think how that sort of came out was through the publication of the NHS's first major workforce plan, which was a huge achievement given that, the Treasury has always been very, very sceptical of doing something like that. And obviously the stars had aligned somewhat with Jeremy Hunt being in there. She also had to work in a fairly unstable environment. So as I noted, there's lots of different bosses that she had. I mean, she had several bosses over a very, very short period of time, all of which had slightly different ways of working and slightly different operating models. And I think she sort of has taken her role to be one of trying to get on with the delivery rather than maybe focus more on the sort of political dynamics. So where her predecessor was more interested in sometimes trying to play the politics to extract benefit, I think she was more interested in maybe trying to work behind the scenes to get some of those benefits, such as that workforce plan. So I think she should be very much commended for the efforts that were made, and there was some real progress made on that, particularly on that workforce piece, that she can look back on. But now clearly she feels it's time for a change.
Yeah, well, Richard, you and I both heard Amanda speak at the Nuffield Health Summit a few days ago. And, it was a funny, warm, rather brave speech, really. She's clearly proud of many of the things she's achieved. And you're right about workforce. Just a few days ago, we saw improved retention statistics. Last year's staff survey was a bit better than we'd seen the years before. There's a new staff survey being published this week, and I suspect that will also show progress. So a lot that she's achieved, and like all leaders, you don't really see the full effects of your leadership often until you've moved on. But let's look at the kind of political strategy a bit, because that's, I think, where some people would have questions. You were a special advisor in the later days of Simon Stevens' tenure at NHS England, and he had a different, slightly more kind of combative way of thinking about his role, didn't he?
So I think Simon had just a slightly different license to operate than Amanda did. If you remember when Simon came in, Matthew, in 2014, it was on the back of the Lansley reforms, and ministers very much wanted the NHS to sort of go quiet. They wanted someone who they could trust to get on with running the system, who could manage, frankly, the politics for them. And actually, if you think about Simon's tenure between 2014 and into the 2020s, it did coincide with the Conservative Party being the largest party at those elections in 2015, 2017 and 2019. So politically, it sort of worked. Amanda's license to operate was very, very different, and actually was more reflective of her character, which was, given the impact of COVID and the need for ministers to get a lot closer to the service and ask more of it, she was much more focused on the sort of core delivery, and actively chose, I think, not to meddle in any of the sort of more wider political arguments. Occasionally, Simon would pop up on a Sunday morning on a sofa in BBC and talk about the need for social care reform, which hadn't necessarily gone through ministerial clearance. Amanda was never going to do that, and she was much more of a sort of behind the scenes type of operator. So they were very different characters, but they also had very, I think, different, as I say, licenses to operate based on their sort of timing of when they were in place.
Yeah, and Simon is rated highly in the health service because there were those moments when he went out, particularly over money, and kind of laid an ultimatum down to government, which government found it hard to resist. But, many people told me that wasn't viewed entirely positively in Whitehall, which might have been why Amanda was given a different brief. I mean, I guess my experience, Richard, sometimes was that what you would hear from NHS England was that they were in tough negotiations with government, and there'd be a kind of implicit suggestion that we and NHS providers should go out and kind of emphasise the challenges facing the service, the need for more investment. And then a figure would emerge, and this is really from the previous government in terms of funding, and NHS England would then be very, very positive about it, that it would demonstrate their success in negotiation. But it didn't necessarily feel that to the service. I think that the challenge is if you adopt an approach which is, I'm not going to make a noise externally, I'm going to try and win these arguments through kind of backdoor channels, through private conversations. The problem is if you don't seem to be winning that many arguments, that does have an impact on your credibility.
Yeah, and I think that's right. Simon's tenure was more reflective of him being a specialist advisor, picking moments to have more political type arguments and structuring those arguments in a certain way in the public sphere. And Amanda being what would be more, Matthew, from a sort of civil service, was more of a private office approach, sort of making representations behind the scenes. But I think in a very tricky, challenging environment, which Amanda found herself in when she took the job, sometimes I think there maybe was a perception from those in the NHS that what was she getting for that sort of what would be seen as being perhaps loyalty to the government. And I think that's where the pointing to the workforce plan is a major output of that strategic approach, because I think she took the view that making those behind the scenes representations got that outcome and got a positive outcome, which had never really happened before. So different styles, different eras, different ways of operating, strengths and weaknesses, I think, to both. And as we look to the new person coming in, it's going to be interesting to see what approach is now adopted.
Yeah, so let's turn to that new person, to Sir Jim Mackey. Let me share with you something that someone said to me just before they went into NHS England in a senior role a few years ago. They said NHS England's got three roles: managing up into Whitehall, managing down into the system, and being an effective arm's length organisation. It spends nearly all its time doing the first, some of its time doing the second, and virtually no time doing the third. Now, that's pretty harsh. I suspect, however, it does reflect the perception sometimes out in the service. Do you think Jim is the person to kind of change that, particularly now that kind of first role, that arguing with the department, has kind of diminished now, because the expectation is that NHS England and the department will really work as a single team?
Yeah, I think it's interesting on the sort of tripartite kind of ambitions. I mean, I think Jim, there's a couple of interesting things with the Jim appointment. One is, of course, that he's very much being positioned as a transitional appointment, albeit for a transitional period of up to 2 years. Now, normally in any job of this nature, someone being given a sort of more interim role would be slightly odd, and would almost be a kind of, with people sort of looking at it saying, well, how long is this going to last? How's this going to work? I don't think those questions are actually being asked here for a couple of reasons. One is lots of people nationally and within the NHS know Jim and know him very, very well. He's very well respected, and he worked obviously on the previous elective recovery plan. And secondly, because he's been appointed by a new Secretary of State with quite a clear kind of remit on the back of the planning guidance that came out recently to get on and deliver, particularly on the government's number one priority, which is to get the elective waiting list down, which is very much in Jim's sweet spot. So the optics of it are quite interesting in terms of we're going to appoint someone on a more interim basis, but at the same time, this is a familiar face who knows their way around, who can probably get things done. On the kind of third part of your three sort of elements, creating an effective arm's length body, I think what Jim's remit here will primarily be is clearly to slim down NHS England and focus on fewer things and doing them better. Now, we've heard this before, but this is clearly where the government is going. Some of this is to do with necessity. There isn't lots of money to spend on lots of priorities. But also, Matthew, so I think sort of philosophically, I think Wes Streeting has also bought into the fact that you can't do everything from the centre and you do have to devolve and delegate. So I think Jim's coming in at a very interesting time, but he's also going to hit the ground running. He's not going to be one of these CEOs who comes in and spends 3 months doing a review, meeting everyone, and then sort of another 3 months doing an external kind of tour. I think he's going to be straight in, as indeed he is already, and he knows what his job is, and that's to deliver on electives.
Yeah, no, really interesting. And I remember a comment that Amanda made to me, I don't know, more than a year ago, I think. But I was, lamenting, as I often do, the kind of level of output of NHS England, the amount of different things they were trying to do, the amount of different programs, the overlap, the lack of joining up. And I remember she said something to me like, well, she said, sometimes I go out of my office and I wander around and I ask people what they're doing. And I realise there are lots of things happening that I'm not fully across. This is an organisation that just seems to generate stuff. And she was articulating her frustration with that. And I think, she made some impact in that regard. But maybe it did require and has required this bigger political shift in order to be able to change that kind of culture in NHS England, that they kind of need to have a national programme for everything that moves in the NHS. That more profound process of prioritisation, doing less, maybe getting partners like NHS Confederation, providers and other organisations to do some of the heavy lifting. It doesn't all have to be done from the centre. I think Amanda could kind of see that. But as I say, do you think it needed this bigger political moment, Wes Streeting really leaning into this and being very, very clear that he wants change to be able to shift that culture?
Yeah, I think you do need ministers to kind of set out quite clear expectations, and it's quite clear that Wes wants to do that. I mean, in some ways, Matthew, what we're doing, the pendulum is swinging again, isn't it, policy-wise? We're going back through Lansley, because interestingly, Lansley's original vision for the NHS Commissioning Board, as it was then, was as a thin management layer. But we're also really going back to the kind of late 2000s, where you have the sort of another sort of tripartite model of governance with the department, with the Secretary of State at the top, and you have the permanent secretary running the Department of Health, you have the chief executive of the NHS running the NHS, and you have the chief medical officer looking after the sort of health of the nation. And I think we are sort of moving back to that sort of a model, and the rumours and sort of murmurings are that that's the model that they're most attracted to. And obviously that was the model that was run under the previous Labour administration, and that will involve lots more tough decisions at NHS England about headcount. And I do think it also explains why Amanda probably feels that now is the right time to move on, because the NHS England has just completed, or fairly recently completed, a headcount reduction significantly, and for her to then front up another headcount reduction would, I think, have been very, very difficult. So both personally and actually just practically. So I think both of those things were a factor here. But I think, yeah, structurally at the centre, we're probably moving back to the sort of that late 2000s era on how things were structured, and a much leaner NHS, top of the NHS as a result.
And what, Richard, does this mean for the relationship between the centre and the service? So, I think broadly speaking, what I hear from people is that this explicit recognition that NHSE and DHSE need to work hand in glove, it is good, because the fiction of NHSE's independence has been clear for a while. I mean, as I said on the Today programme, I think on Saturday, Steve Barclay had kind of screens up in his office telling him exactly how many ambulances were waiting outside every A&E. I mean, this is not the behaviour of someone who's devolving operational leadership to another organisation. But at the same time as in a sense, in the centre, we're seeing power centralised within the department. Wes Streeting talks a lot about wanting to devolve more to the service. And, indeed, he was wanting to point out that in the recent planning guidance, that several targets, ring fences, had been removed. So how do these things work? I remember somebody telling me about Whitehall many, many years ago, that the thing about Whitehall was that, on the one hand, England was a very centralised country. The power really lay in Whitehall. But on the other hand, Whitehall itself was quite devolved. It had quite a weak centre, particularly in number 10 of the Cabinet Office. So these kind of two things are related. We're now going to have a stronger, united centre between the department and NHS England. Does that mean it'll be a more controlling centre, or could it mean it becomes a centre which both wants to and has to devolve more?
Yeah, I think this is really, really interesting. I'm not sure if you saw recently, but the Health Service Journal sort of devised a chart showing the different people influencing or feeding into the lower 10-year health plan. And it was a sort of real array of faces and names from a whole range of different sort of central organisations, whether they were non-executive directors at the departments, special advisors who are not special advisors but have been hired in, new chairs of arm's length bodies, a new DHSE strategy team, and others. And there's this who's who of sort of central health policy, which sort of gave an impression that the centre was sort of growing, not shrinking, and a lot of cooks trying to sort of feed into that 10-year plan recipe. But I wonder whether, Matthew, what we're seeing is something a bit, or I'm going to use the phrase Osborneite in terms of its structure, when thinking about how government ran economic policy in the sort of 2010s. So if you think about what George Osborne did with the economy in terms of reducing spending, what he did was he protected certain budgets and was very clear about that, whether it was the NHS or schools in particular, parts of the defence budget. And then other budgets were sort of asked to be cut back and trimmed back, and particularly local government. And what you see with the sort of Wes Streeting model here is you see protection of certain targets, certain budgets, so particularly thinking about electives and other things in the planning guidance. Some support for the shifts, so public health grant being one example, that had an uplift recently, and the GP contract, which had an uplift, both very, very important to making those hospital to community treatment to prevention shifts. But then the kind of ask of the service, which is, well, locally, you need to then decide what is cut back and what is trimmed, and we will back you to do that. And what we're seeing with that, with those kind of local decision makers having to make quite tough local decisions, is coming through already. So again, piece in the HSJ just today, I think it is, or this week, on cuts to cancer and new cancer services and cuts to virtual wards. The architecture is quite interesting, which is essentially we're going to set some priorities. We're going to try and protect the funding for those. We're going to set some targets we expect you to deliver. We're going to try and support some of the shifts relating to the plan as well. Then everything else is really up to you. And then there's the call of we'll back you to make the tough call, which will be interesting to see how that plays out when those tough decisions genuinely do play through in terms of cuts to services.
Yeah, well, so Richard, I'm going to get you to imagine that you're sitting with Wes Streeting in your former role as a special advisor, and Wes Streeting is saying to you, well, look, here's the strategy, Richard. It is to unify the team at the centre, to do less but to do it better, to be absolutely kind of adamantine about the need to hit our key kind of retail targets, particularly the waiting list, which appears to be, as far as I can see, the only thing that number 10 really cares about, but also to devolve beyond that, recognizing that if we're going to put systems and providers under the kind of financial pressure they're under, we have got to give them latitude to kind of get on with it as best they can. Now, Wes Streeting says that to you and then says to you, but Richard, what do you think are the dangers? What are the perils of this strategy? What do we need to do to make sure that this is something that sticks?
Yeah, this comes back to the centralised system, Matthew, and this comes back to Parliament. So when local NHS leaders have to make tough calls on where to spend pounds and where not to spend pounds, and those things appear in the media, whether it's the health media or whether it's local media or indeed even national media, what's your response to that as a health secretary going to be? Is it going to be, well, we haven't sanctioned this, they need to look again, which would, I think, create a lot of confusion in the system about, okay, so if the health secretary doesn't like it, it's not going to happen. Or does the health secretary then lean in and then explore an argument for why these trade-offs have to be made and what the upside is of making such decisions and why you have to make the decisions as they are. But that requires a really strong political communication strategy. And I think you have to link that back over to that 10-year plan reform agenda. And you have to communicate that really, really clearly, because you will have a lot of parliamentarians in particular areas who will be inundated with letters about particular cuts to services or clawbacks, who will then be making representations to you. So, reform is not cost-free. And if you're going to put more money into one part of the system, another part of the system is not going to necessarily see the same amount of money. So you've got to have that really strong political communication operation, and you've got to then really kind of follow through on that. And that's where all eyes, I think, are turning particularly to that 10-year plan.
Yes, and here I think, an opportunity for Penny Dash and Jim Mackey, who can represent different parts of the service. Penny, the ICS movement, Jim, obviously the provider leader, incredibly successful acute leader. If the strategy is to say you've got less money, you've got to deliver these targets, but in other areas, we're going to give you the latitude to get on with it, and we're not going to contradict you when you have to do difficult things which might upset backbench MPs and local councillors and whoever it might be. I think it's going to be important, isn't it, for Jim and Penny to say, look, if that is the strategy, you have got to stick with it. Because if that's the strategy, then every few months you say, oh, no, we can't do that unpopular reconfiguration over there. And no, we can't, cut that service back there. Then you really are moving to a situation where leadership is almost impossible. I mean, what we've been saying about the financial situation, which I want to come back to in a second, Richard, is that we all know the reality. We all read the newspapers. We know there's no more money, not this year, and almost certainly not next year and not the year after. But the centre can't simply dump that risk onto the shoulders of leaders. It's got to think about how it supports leaders in making those difficult choices.
Yeah, Matthew, that's absolutely right. And also, it also comes back to the role of number 10 here and their wider political strategy. And I know you had Bill Morgan on recently talking about some of the dynamics here and some of the risks if number 10 isn't necessarily across all of these discussions. Because I agree with you, at the top of the NHS, senior NHS leaders need to lean in and back those changes if that's what the model is. Ministers in the Department of Health need to do that. but the wider government also needs to be on board for this. I thought Keir Starmer, there's a letter from cabinet memo that went round from Keir Starmer recently that the BBC got hold of. And I'm not sure if you saw it, but it's very, very interesting on the kind of government's wider political strategy, basically saying that delivery is not going to be enough. Deliverism, just improving things a bit, is not going to be sufficient politically. And in the letter, which Laura Koonsberg and the BBC got hold of, he uses a phrase which is very, very interesting, which means taking on vested interests of all kinds, and it means challenging laws that hold Britain back. So that kind of language is really, really strong. And I think sort of lends itself to one of politically Number 10 saying, we will back you if you're doing the right thing and you're moving things in the direction that we've said is correct. But there is a wider question here, which you've alluded to, which is Number 10 cited on elements of this, and what does it actually think? Is it going to be there in the trenches when these really difficult conversations do come to light? So, yeah, some fascinating dynamics there, I think.
Which then takes me to my kind of final question, Richard, which is all of this possible? I mean, we are talking about, as I say, not just next year, but the years to come, the tightest financial settlement, tighter even than the kind of harshest years of austerity. And of course, austerity came after the NHS had many years to invest, where arguably there was a bit of fat to be trimmed from the bone. That's not where we are now. So we've got this context. We've got a government demanding really rapid progress in those key kind of delivery areas. We don't have any reform of social care on the horizon, and you know how big a challenge that is for health service as well. Do you think it's possible to get through the next 3 years without plunging into crisis and last-minute bailouts and all of that? And if it is, what's your view? What's your advice to leaders? What do they need to do to turn these next 3 years, not just from a kind of terrible war of attrition, but into an opportunity to do things really differently?
I think it comes back to the sort of discussion we were having is around permission and a license to operate and to deliver change. And the thing I think is just going to be fascinating to see is how much license local leaders are really given to make change happen and what levers they're going to be given to do that. I think there's a big, big question mark, Matthew, on this 10-year plan. When this was commissioned back in the autumn, the environment was very, very different. This was a government with a big majority. There wasn't such issues with the Trump administration and defence spending, and we hadn't seen national insurance gone up and everything else. We hadn't seen reform surging in the polls as they sort of have done in recent months. So the runway for landing that has got a lot narrower. And the big strategic call for Wes Streeting in all of this is, does he double down and go, right, the NHS is broken. We are going to do radical reform. We're going to move money around in a certain way. We're going to make some really difficult decisions. Or does he go a little bit more cautious and say, well, we'll nudge things forward a bit. We'll make them slightly better. And by doing that, we can show a trajectory which politically we think will be sufficient. Now, the rhetoric from Wes and his team and others has been very much in the former camp rather than the latter. But the proof of it will be in the pudding when that 10-year plan comes out. And, are ministers prepared to make these very difficult trade-offs and empower leaders to make these difficult decisions? And that's where all eyes are on, I think, the next 5 or 6 months, which will set the tone and model of change over the course of this parliament. And that's why that 10-year plan is so, so important. We've been here before with other plans, but when the health secretary stood up and said, the NHS is broken and I'm going to develop a 10-year plan to fix it, that raises expectations quite highly. So it's going to be fascinating to see how that's landed.
Well, Richard, we like Health Online to be topical, but how about this? As you and I are speaking here on Monday lunchtime, we've just heard that Julian Kelly is leaving NHS England. Now, I've loved working with Julian. He's a really, really nice guy. And I shared Amanda's dismay a few months ago when he was getting a lot of stick from the HSJ and others in terms of the way in which he was putting pressure on providers and systems. But, he's been a kind of pretty fixed and reliable part of the architecture of health. So how do you respond to that information that's literally arrived as we're speaking?
Yeah, it's obviously major news because, as you say, Julian's been sort of in the top of the NHS for a long, long time. Obviously, previously in the civil service and in the Treasury, very well respected been clearly at the forefront of some of these sort of difficult discussions that have been taking place with the new government about where to prioritise spending and what the trade-offs are. He was sort of in public recently, sort of was saying that the new money that was being announced would cover, pay and deficits primarily. I'm not sure that went down too well with ministers. But what we're seeing, Matthew, is clearly a big clear out of very, very important figures. I mean, you've got the chief medical officer, the chief executive and the CFO all at the same time quitting. This is a significant shift of power within the system. And it's just another example, I think, of ministers really wanting to take greater control. There's been talk for a while about greater financial oversight from the DH and more sort of joint working on financial arrangements. But yeah, Julian's decision to go, as we're recording, is really big news.
And I guess over this announcement, there will hang the same question that still hangs a bit over Amanda's announcement, which is, did he leave because he felt he was being pressured to leave, or did he leave because he felt that what he was being asked to do in relation to the service and the financial situation was just too difficult? Knowing Julian, knowing how professional and discreet he is, I suspect we'll never know.
And also, obviously, we've got this planning round going on right now. I mean, there was a meeting of last week, I think it was, on the deficit situation, where initial plans had been submitted and the NHS England was talking to local systems about what those plans meant. So that, again, just creates further instability into that sort of planning round that's taking place right now, Matthew. It's unclear who those plans are being agreed with those sort of major figures taking a step back. So Department of Health and Social Care needs to be very much across that because, you've got the finance director now stepping away.
Well, Richard, thanks as ever for your insights. No doubt we'll speak again as all of this unfolds. Thank you for joining us on Health on the Line.
Thanks, Matthew. Great to speak.
And that just leaves me to introduce our latest Leader in Six interview, which I was delighted to do on a visit recently in my own hometown of York. I spoke to Sarah Coltman-Lovell, York NHS Place Director. There's really some fantastic stuff happening here in York. So, Sarah, first question, what's the biggest challenge you're dealing with at the moment?
I think the most pressing issue for Place and the health service in general at the moment is that everybody is focused quite rightly on doing the right thing within their sector, within their organisation, within their service, particularly with the drive around delivery for 25, 26. So nobody is working, harder than they could already work. Bandwidth, I think, is a real issue. And I think the priority is to do the right thing by your service, which can sometimes mean you're doing the wrong thing by the person. So when we think about system and we think about partnership and we think about residents and we think about giving professionals a satisfying job to work with, to support and to help people, the system isn't always conducive to that. And the harder that people work, the harder it is to do the right thing. So I would say it's about bandwidth to be able to engage in really supporting healthy living.
Tell me, what's the innovation you're most excited by in the York Place?
So in York Place, it's been a real journey over the last couple of years, I think, in terms of getting to a place where partners trust each other, where there's a credible sort of leadership environment to be able to lead and actually get to the real heart of the power and the potential of Place. And I think we're there. I think the work we've done around the neighbourhood model, so establishing through a co-led approach with our council, so council and health developing coterminous boundaries to operate public sector transformation through, and the hub models that we've developed in terms of multi-agency right through the life course. So for families, for mental health, for frailty, have also really helped us understand the challenges and the pitfalls of multi-agency working. So now being able to take that learning and into our neighbourhood model, having the holy grail of coterminous public health services, really, really excited by that. And I think we've probably found some quite surprising benefits to perhaps what we thought were problems as well. So, for example, primary care networks, they aren't geographically contiguous in York. Some primary care networks actually span all four the neighbourhoods in the city. And we've only actually got one that is geographically contiguous, and that's the east of York. But actually, that hasn't been a problem at all. So recognising the differences between business models and neighbourhood models the difference between practices and services working in a neighbourhood and relating to a neighbourhood. So not getting too hung up about some of the problems or perceived problems actually has been quite liberating.
Brilliant. If you were king or queen of the NHS for a day, what's the one thing you'd do?
I love this question. So if I was queen of the NHS for a day and I'm going to stick to the rules and stick to the NHS, I would flat cash the acute sector. I would do that because I think that's what the acute sector is potentially wanting but too afraid to ask for, in terms of the level of expectation constantly on the acute sector to constantly meet demand. And, we are in a scenario whereby every bit of spare cash has to effectively go to the bottom line in order to kind of move out of this kind of greedy NHS gobbling everything up. In the meantime, risks are rising, people continue to get ill, and the ability to stop those rising risks falling into the highest risk year on year is lost. So we're dealing with this exponential kind of higher pool of people who are at the highest risk and therefore highest use of services. And we've got to do something to break the cycle. So I think if I was queen for the day, I would bring in flat cash. Just as a second one, if I was allowed to have another one, I would be redesignating a whole host of acute specialties to community specialties. So geriatric medicine, general internal medicine, dermatology, neurology, why are they in hospitals? So forcing a little bit of change there wouldn't go amiss.
Tell us something that's interesting about you that's nothing to do with your job.
Probably the thing that most people would see first when I walk into a room right now is the fact that I'm also growing a human in my spare time, which is interesting at the age of 44 and a husband who's 50 with a 16 and an 18-year-old at home. This is what happens when you go on holiday to California, folks.
Well, I'm a 64-year-old with a 12-year-old. So the older you are, the better it is what I would say. Much better second time round.
Don't tell that to my kids.
Tell me, what leader have you most admired? Maybe someone that you work with, someone you've read about, but which leader is most inspiring?
So who inspires me? I think I'm a bit of a magpie when it comes to leadership. So I take inspiration from many. I don't think there's any kind of one way or perfect person, but I really admire sort of quiet strength. I admire those who listen more and say less. In terms of who I've worked with in the past, I mean, Julian Hartley in Leeds I often kind of, shamelessly borrow Leadership 101 from Julian. But one of the things I do remember him doing, which I was really impressed about, was as an acute trust, he really relished the fact that he was a system leader for prevention. So, showing others how it can be done and again, leading from the front and being the person who steps outside and looks behind and says, who's going to follow me, folks?
Great. Well, Julian's a fantastic person, of course. Last question. Tell us something that you've been watching on TV, listening to as a podcast, reading as a book, a bit of content that you think everyone else should enjoy, and it can be as trashy as you like.
I was going to go highbrow. Well, I am a bit trashy when it comes to TV. I have just been laughing out loud to Amanda Land. If anyone hasn't seen it, hilarious. Follow up to Motherland, which I will be in very soon. So high up my list. But given that I just mentioned Leeds, I would also just put a shout out for anyone who's interested in understanding a little bit more about what neighbourhoods are, what neighbourhoods do. Check out the Local Care Partnership blogs. Very, very good.
Excellent. So something virtuous, something fun. Sarah, thanks so much for talking to me.
Thank you.
Do go onto our website and listen to previous episodes of Health on the Line, including our recent conversation with Sally Warren and with Bill Morgan on the 10-year plan and, everything else that's going on in the health service. But until next time, thanks and goodbye.
You've been listening to Health on the Line from the NHS Confederation. Visit nhsconfed.org for more information about us and to register for events and webinars that delve deeper into the issues explored in this podcast.